In the heart of the Carolina Lowcountry in 1842, where endless rows of cotton stretched farther than a slave's dreams of freedom, a grand plantation stood as a world unto itself. The summers were heavy with heat and the buzzing of cicadas, and the swamps along the Edisto River carried more secrets than they did water. Official records from that year remain conspicuously silent about one particular plantation tragedy, as if history itself dared not put it to paper. But among the whispers of those who lived it, the story endures. A tale of celebration turned to horror, of justice served on a silver platter, and of a woman who took fate into her own hands. It happened on a night that should have been filled with joy. At Edenwood Plantation, a luxurious estate not far from Charleston, a wedding banquet was underway, an event meant to unite two of the region's most prominent families. Instead, as the candles burned low and the music drifted under the moss-draped oaks, that banquet transformed into something unspeakable. Servants would later recall how laughter gave way to screams, how the opulent dining hall became a scene of chaos and death. By dawn, 16 members of the Carolina gentry lay dead, faces contorted in pain, the last course they ever tasted still on their tongues. Doctors and officials were baffled. Newspapers dubbed it an inexplicable family tragedy. But there was an answer hidden in plain sight, though few dared to speak it aloud. The truth lay in the calloused hands of someone no one thought capable of such fury. A cook who had lost everything, yet found something far more powerful. She found the patience to serve a cold, meticulous vengeance on the finest china that Southern society could offer. This is the story of Clara, an enslaved chef who turned spices into revenge and recipes into death sentences. A woman who chose her own surname on the very night she decided she would never again belong to anyone but herself. She was known simply as Clara on the plantation, property in the eyes of the law, but in the quiet of her soul, she had already renamed herself, and by the end of this tale, that name would be seared into the memory of all who heard it. Before we continue, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from. If you're new to our channel, welcome. We're glad you found us. Be sure to hit that subscribe button for more chilling historical tales that official history preferred to forget. Colonel Nathaniel Mason, the master of Edenwood, prided himself on being a gentleman of the old Southern tradition. Tall and lean, with eyes as cold and gray as winter rain, he moved and spoke with calculated calm. He had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded it relentlessly, ruling over more than 200 enslaved souls. By Mason's creed, the best way to maintain order was with an iron fist and a velvet glove. Discipline was strict, sometimes brutal, but he believed that tempering punishment with small rewards kept his slaves obedient far better than constant violence. In his view, it was a benevolent cruelty. Fear when needed, favors when possible, all of it to protect his interests. Edenwood's true pride, however, was not its cotton fields, or even its stately mansion. It was the dining table. Colonel Mason's dinners were famous across the Lowcountry. Politicians from Columbia, cotton brokers up from Charleston, and planters from neighboring counties all coveted an invitation to Edenwood's feast-laden table. The plantation's wealth was on full display during these banquets. Crystal chandeliers, imported wines, courses of food that never seemed to end. But the secret to Edenwood's culinary renown lay in the skilled hands of a woman most guests never even laid eyes on. Her name was Clara. Just Clara. Like most enslaved people, she had no true surname. She had arrived at Edenwood as an 8-year-old child, sold away from a failing estate in Virginia in 1825. Back then, she was all skinny limbs, curious eyes, and a heart full of fear. Fate, however, placed her under the wing of Edenwood's head cook, an elderly enslaved woman everyone called Mama Grace. It didn't take long for Mama Grace to notice the little girl's uncanny gift. Clara had a memory for flavors and scents that bordered on genius. At age 9, she could recreate a bread pudding recipe from taste alone. By 10, she knew the spice mix for Mistress Mason's favorite stew better than the mistress did herself. Mama Grace was not just a cook, she was a healer and a keeper of old wisdom. Born in Africa and torn from her homeland as a young woman, she carried in her mind generations of knowledge about plants, herbs, and their properties. As she taught Clara how to fry fish and stew greens, she also taught her which leaves brewed into a tea could soothe a fever, which roots could numb pain or induce sleep, and which could do far worse. "Every plant got a purpose, child," she would whisper late at night, as they hung bundles of herbs from the rafters to dry. Some to heal, others to harm. The Lord puts tools in our hands, and it's up to us how we use them. Clara soaked up these lessons. By the light of the hearth embers, Mama Grace even taught Clara her letters, tracing shapes in the ashes so the girl learned to read and write in secret. "Knowledge is the one thing they can't take from you," Mama Grace would say, tapping a gnarled finger to Clara's forehead. That idea took root deeply in the young girl's soul. For years, Clara grew in skill and confidence under Mama Grace's tutelage. What started as an extra pair of small hands plucking chickens and grinding corn turned into a true apprentice chef at the old woman's side. By her teenage years, Clara could bake flaky biscuits, spice a Brunswick stew, and caramelize a sugar glaze as expertly as any New Orleans chef. When Mama Grace died of a fever in the winter of 1838, it was only natural that 20-year-old Clara stepped into her role as Edenwood's head cook. Even Mistress Catherine Mason, a nervous, delicate lady prone to fainting spells and dosed daily with laudanum, conceded that no one could replace Clara. The colonel's wife continued to plan the menus for special occasions, relying on an old family recipe book, but it was Clara who made those meals sing. Under Clara's management, the kitchen at Edenwood ran like a well-tuned fiddle. She oversaw a staff of 5 young women, each trained by her hand. Hannah baked breads and pies. Dinah tended the spit and the roasts. Suki managed the boiling pots of vegetables and simmering sauces. The others chopped, fetched, and kept the fire stoked. Clara directed them with a calm authority that even the mistress respected. Yet for all her delegation, Clara kept the most critical tasks for herself. The secret spice blends, the final tasting of each dish, the timing that could make or ruin a roast. Those were hers alone. In the sweltering domain of the kitchen, Clara was a queen in all but name. Life for Clara's little family at Edenwood was as stable as an enslaved life could be. Not long after taking over the kitchen, she married Jacob, the plantation's blacksmith, a tall, strong man with kind eyes and a steady demeanor. Together, they had 3 children in quick succession: a son Daniel in 1835, a daughter Rebecca in 1837, and another son Henry in 1839. Clara's children became the sunshine of her world. Because of Clara's value to the household, the Masons granted her a few privileges not given to others. She and Jacob were allowed to live together in a slightly larger cabin, and the colonel quietly assured her that her family would never be sold so long as she kept his larder and table overflowing with excellence. It was an unspoken bargain. Clara's unparalleled skill for the illusion of security. And Clara believed in it, tending to her craft with all the more devotion, hopeful that in pleasing the Masons, she was also protecting her husband and babies from the auction block. By 1842, however, storm clouds of a more personal nature gathered over Edenwood Plantation. They came in the form of Colonel Mason's eldest son, Augustus Mason, newly returned from several years of schooling in Charleston. Augustus was 22, handsome, well-dressed, and utterly rotten to his core. Those who knew the colonel in his youth said Augustus was what his father must have been like, without the tempering effects of age and responsibility. He had the Mason cold gray eyes, but in the sun they burned with cruel mischief. In Charleston, Augustus had learned plenty about fine wines and cards, but not a lick of empathy. He swaggered about Edenwood with the entitlement of a young man who sees the world and every person in it as his playthings. At first, Augustus barely noticed Clara or the other domestic slaves. He was too busy carousing with old school friends and ordering new riding boots from London. But idle hands and idle minds often drift toward dark amusements. It wasn't long before the young master's attentions turned to the only toys available on the isolated plantation, the people who technically belonged to him. Clara first sensed trouble when she caught Augustus loitering in the kitchen doorway one afternoon, watching the girls knead dough. He flashed an easy smile that didn't reach his cold eyes and complimented the smell of the day's peach cobbler. Clara thanked him politely and kept her girls focused on their tasks. But after he left, she noticed how 16-year-old Hannah's hands trembled slightly, or how Dinah exhaled in relief. They felt it too, the predatory gaze of a man who saw prey, not people. From that day on, Clara took silent measures to guard her young assistants. If Augustus wandered into the kitchen, even under some friendly pretense, Clara made sure to position herself between him and the others, engaging him with talk of food until she could smoothly usher him out. She assigned the prettiest girl to work in the pantry or back garden whenever the master's son was likely to be about. Still, she couldn't be everywhere, and Augustus's twisted appetites, once piqued, only grew. He began accidentally crossing paths with the maids in the laundry yard or catching a housegirl alone in a hallway to whisper some indecent suggestion that left her shaken. Clara soon realized Augustus had developed a dangerous taste for tormenting the defenseless. What she couldn't have known was that, in trying to shield her kitchen girls, she had inadvertently directed Augustus's attention elsewhere, toward her own children. It started innocently, or so it seemed. One hot July afternoon, Augustus came upon little Daniel, then 7 years old, struggling to carry a basket of fresh eggs to the kitchen. The boy recognized the master's son and offered a respectful, "Good day, massa." Augustus, with a friendly grin, knelt and took 2 eggs from the basket. "You've done well, boy," he said. Daniel beamed at the praise. until Augustus casually cracked both eggs over the child's head. Yolks and whites ran down Daniel's face and shoulders as Augustus walked away laughing. When Clara heard about the incident later, she was furious, but she bit her tongue and comforted her humiliated son as best she could. Confronting Augustus directly was out of the question. Instead, she privately begged Colonel Mason to speak to his son about being gentler around the young ones. The colonel dismissed it as a childish prank and assured her he'd mention it. Whether he ever did is debatable. Regardless, Augustus's so-called pranks escalated. The next week, he caught Rebecca, only 5 years old, by the well, and with a syrupy smile, pushed her in up to her shoulders before pulling her out, sputtering and crying as he roared with laughter. He even approached toddler Henry once, offering the 2-year-old a peppermint stick only to snatch it away and toss it into a patch of stinging nettles where the child couldn't go without getting pricked. A slow terror began to grip the slave quarters whenever Augustus's roaming figure was spotted in the distance. Mothers would call their children indoors. Fathers would find urgent chores that kept the youngsters at their side. Clara started bringing her children to the kitchen to play in the courtyard under her watch whenever she could, but she had duties to attend to and couldn't guard them every second. Augustus, meanwhile, treated the fear he generated as just another form of entertainment. In his warped mind, he likely thought he was teaching these people their place, that no matter how safe or happy they felt, it could all be snatched away on a whim. By the first weeks of October 1842, the uneasy truce of Edenwood had reached a breaking point. That autumn was deceptively beautiful. The oak trees around the plantation lane blazed gold and orange, and the air carried the sweet scent of harvested rice drying in sheaves. But the beauty masked growing dread. Clara clung to the routines of her kitchen and the hope that if she just stayed useful and kept her head down, her family would remain intact. It was an illusion, and deep down she knew it. As an enslaved woman, any peace she had was at the whim of her owner's mercy and their family's moods. That fragile peace was about to be shattered by one casual act of cruelty. The morning of October 16th, 1842, began like many others, with Clara rising before dawn to stoke the kitchen fires. Colonel Mason had invited a handful of fellow planters over for a midday discussion about cotton prices and canal projects, which meant Clara was expected to serve an impressive luncheon. She threw herself into the work, happy for the distraction. By mid-morning, tantalizing aromas of oyster stew and roasting game hens wafted from the kitchen. Clara's children, who had been helping with small chores in the quarters, soon trotted over to see Mama and perhaps snag a treat. Clara greeted Daniel, 7, Rebecca, 5, and Henry, 2, with warm smiles and a piece of sweet cornbread each. The children's faces, still sticky with molasses, lifted her spirits instantly. Even as she supervised her assistants and juggled multiple dishes, Clara kept one eye on her little ones playing just outside the kitchen door. Daniel was minding his siblings responsibly, as he always did when she had to work, proudly showing Rebecca how to toss a pebble so it skipped across a puddle, or spinning little Henry around until he giggled. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to dream. Maybe one day, by some miracle, her children would grow up free. Maybe Daniel would learn letters as she had, and become a learned man. Maybe Rebecca would cultivate the healing wisdom of herbs passed down from Mama Grace. Maybe Henry would live a long, ordinary life where he could simply be a child, not property. They were dangerous dreams. Clara knew it. She forced herself back to reality and gently reminded the children to stay in the courtyard where she could see them. Daniel puffed out his chest and promised, "We'll be good, Mama." Clara kissed the top of his head, ruffled Rebecca's hair, and gave Henry a playful pat before returning to her stew pots. The luncheon went off splendidly. Clara outdid herself, serving dish after dish that made the visiting planters sigh with contentment. They dined on rich oyster stew spiked with sherry, succulent roast hens with rosemary, and flaky biscuits slathered in fresh churned butter. Every bite reinforced Colonel Mason's reputation as a lavish host, and, by extension, Clara's as a masterful cook. Through the door, she heard the men praising the meal and even raising a toast to the genius in the kitchen. Clara couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This was her protection, she reminded herself, to be so good, so indispensable, that the Masons would never risk losing her or her family. It was nearly 3 o'clock when the luncheon concluded. The guests departed in jovial spirits, and Clara finally had a moment to breathe. She sent her assistants off to tidy up and began putting away leftovers for the house slave's supper. Wiping her brow with a rag, she realized with a start that she hadn't seen her children in over an hour. Usually they would have run back in by now, tugging at her apron for a bite to eat, or just wanting to be near her. A prickle of worry ran through Clara. She stepped outside to scan the yard. The courtyard was empty. The little rag ball Daniel and Rebecca had been playing with lay abandoned in the dust. Clara's pulse quickened. Perhaps one of the older slave children had led them off to play, she told herself. Or maybe Jacob had finished at the forge early and taken them back to the quarters for a nap. Those were reasonable possibilities. She clung to them as she briskly walked toward the slave quarters, eyes searching for any sign of her 3 little ones. She had only made it halfway when she saw Hannah, one of her kitchen girls, running toward her, skirts gathered in her fists and a look of terror on her face. "Miss Clara!" Hannah gasped, in her panic, forgetting that slaves weren't usually allowed honorifics. "There's smoke!" By the old storage shed near the gin house. "It's burning." Clara didn't even respond. Her legs were already moving, propelling her past Hannah like a deer through the fields. Over the top of the cabins, beyond the cotton gin, a column of thick black smoke curled into the sky. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. That shed was a place her children occasionally played hide-and-seek, despite her warnings to stay away from the old, unused building. By the time Clara reached the shed, a few field hands had formed a bucket brigade, flinging pails of water at the inferno that raged. The structure, a small barn-like outbuilding that once stored tools and tobacco, was completely engulfed in flames. Heat blasted Clara's face. Smoke clawed at her lungs. Over the roar of the fire, she heard muffled screams from inside. High-pitched, desperate screams that she knew in her bones. "My babies! They're in there!" Clara screamed. Before anyone could stop her, she lunged toward the shed's closed door. 2 strong men grabbed her around the waist just as she gripped the handle. The metal seared her palm. It was red hot and locked. Someone had barred the door from the outside with the heavy crossbeam. Clara thrashed in the men's arms like a wild animal. "Let me go! My children! My children are in there!" she shrieked, raw panic stripping away any semblance of composure. The slaves holding her. One was Jacob, she dimly realized, his face stricken with horror, tried to pull her back. But Clara's love and terror made her mighty. She fought them with a strength none expected, nearly breaking free. It took Jacob and another man all their effort to drag her clear of the flames as the roof of the shed collapsed in a shower of embers. Clara fell to her knees, claws of anguish tearing at her soul. From within the inferno, the screams of Daniel, Rebecca, and little Henry had faded to nothing. When the fire finally died down enough to approach, a grim search confirmed Clara's worst nightmare. Huddled in a corner of the charred ruins were the tiny, burned remains of her 3 children, still clinging to one another. It appeared Daniel had wrapped himself around his younger siblings in a final, futile act of protection. The sight would be etched into Clara's mind until her last breath. She stood silently as some of the men gently lifted the small bodies and carried them out. Clara had no tears at that moment. Her grief was too deep for crying. Instead, a terrible, icy resolve began to form in the void their loss left behind. Augustus Mason arrived on the scene once the flames were out, riding up on his horse with an expression of feigned shock. He claimed he'd been out for a leisurely ride and saw the smoke. He dismounted and surveyed the devastation coolly. "What a tragedy," he murmured, careful to keep his voice low and somber for the benefit of the watching slaves. "Poor little things. Probably playing where they shouldn't, I reckon. Left a lantern burning, or found some matches. Such a shame." Clara was a few yards away, kneeling in the dirt where her children had died, Jacob's arm around her shoulders. At the sound of Augustus's voice, she looked up slowly and met his eyes. In that instant, she knew. The slight curl of his lips he tried to suppress, the way he avoided stepping too close. He was enjoying this. He might be acting the concerned son in front of his father, who had belatedly shown up, furious about property damage, if not the loss of 3 black children's lives. But Augustus's eyes gave him away. They practically danced with satisfaction. 3 days later, after a quiet burial of small coffins in the slave cemetery, one of Clara's kitchen girls came to her with the final confirmation. Dinah, voice trembling, told Clara she had seen Master Augustus near the old shed that very morning. He'd been laughing with the children, offering to show them a new game in the shed. Dinah had thought it odd. A white man playing hide-and-seek with slave children, but she was gathering herbs and didn't intervene. She recalled how Augustus slid the heavy bolt across the door while Daniel, Rebecca, and Henry were giggling inside, thinking it was all in fun. Dinah admitted she assumed at first he was teasing them and would let them out. Then she saw him casually take out a flint and set a pile of dry brush by the shed ablaze. He'd walked away before the flames really took hold. By the time Dinah processed what was happening and ran for help, it was too late. Clara listened to this account in absolute silence. She didn't scream. She didn't curse Augustus's name or collapse in despair. She simply nodded to Dinah, thanked her for telling the truth, and went back to peeling potatoes for the evening stew. To an onlooker, she appeared numb, broken by tragedy. But inside, Clara's heart turned to stone. That night, she did not sleep. She sat at her rickety table in the cabin that felt so horribly empty now, and made 2 momentous decisions. First, she would never again be simply Clara the cook, Clara the slave. The part of her that had died with her children would be reborn as someone new. She took up a scrap of paper and a pencil stub and wrote the name she claimed: Clara Turner. She chose Turner in honor of Nat Turner, the rebel preacher who had led an enslaved uprising in Virginia just a decade earlier. If ever a soul understood what it meant to demand justice in blood, it was him. And now, so did she. Her second decision was even more daring. Clara vowed that Augustus Mason would pay for what he'd done. And not only him. Colonel Mason, who raised such a monster and turned a blind eye to his sins, would pay. Mistress Catherine, who enjoyed the comforts wrung from Clara's labor while offering only hollow condolences for the loss of property, would pay. And the family about to marry into the Masons, the Sinclairs, they too would pay. For they were people who treated human lives as bargaining chips and never once questioned it. Clara realized now that her children's death was the culmination of 1,000 everyday cruelties of the slaveholding class. All of them thought themselves untouchable. She intended to teach them otherwise. At first, Clara considered something swift, perhaps taking a kitchen knife to Augustus in his sleep, but that would likely mean her own death shortly after, and death was too easy on him anyway. No, she wanted the punishment to fit the crime. Her eyes fell on the collection of herbs and glass jars in the corner of her cabin. Mama Grace's old apothecary chest stood there, filled with the dried plants they'd gathered over the years. Many were benign: chamomile, mint, willow bark. But some were the kind that Mama Grace had only spoken of in hushed tones. The kind of plant that, if brewed into a tea or ground into a paste, could cause immense suffering. Mama Grace had never used them except perhaps to ease someone's passing who was beyond help, but she had told Clara of their power. One in particular, water hemlock, grew in fetid patches by the swamp. Just a small bit will still a man's heart after making it pump like a locomotive, Mama Grace had warned. Clara knew where to find it. She knew when to harvest it. And now, she knew how she would use it. In the weeks following her children's funerals, Clara went about her duties with eerie calm. She cooked, cleaned, and answered "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," as appropriate. Only Jacob sensed the change in her, a distance in her eyes, as if she were looking beyond this place and time. He tried to reach her, to suggest gingerly that maybe they could ask the colonel to sell them, even though they had no money to buy freedom, or to pray for God's justice. Clara only gave him a hollow smile and said, "God might busy himself elsewhere for now. I'll see to justice." Jacob didn't understand what she meant, but it made him uneasy. Meanwhile, news spread that Pearl Mason, the colonel's only daughter, was to be married at the end of January 1843. The preparations for Pearl's wedding to Matthew Sinclair began well in advance, and Mistress Catherine consulted Clara constantly on the elaborate feast she expected to impress the new in-laws. Each such consultation was a dagger in Clara's heart. The Masons had moved on from her children's deaths as if it were a footnote, focusing instead on ensuring their coming celebration was the talk of the county. Clara gave no sign of resentment. She helped plan the menu dutifully, suggesting the finest recipes she knew. Internally, she was planning something else entirely. A wedding, she realized, was the perfect opportunity. All the guilty parties would be gathered in one place, indulging in food and drink that she alone would prepare. It was as if fate itself had set the stage for her. During those late autumn and early winter nights, Clara undertook secret excursions whenever she could slip away. With a burlap sack over her shoulder and a knife at her side, she ventured into the swamps by moonlight. By day, those swamps could be eerily beautiful, draped in Spanish moss, echoing with bird calls. By night, they were downright terrifying. Alligators lurked, water snakes slithered across muddy banks, and swarms of mosquitoes whined in the darkness. Clara felt none of the usual fear. Her heart was so full of a mother's rage that no creature would dare harm her. Or so she believed. She waded into mucky ponds to gather clumps of water hemlock root, careful to keep the toxic juice off her skin, plucked nightshade berries from vine tangles, and harvested the pale, ghostly mushrooms that grew in rings where the plantation's unquiet dead were said to roam. Each find she carried reverently back to her cabin and hid in a locked chest beneath a false bottom, alongside Mama Grace's old recipe book and her own notebook of special recipes. Clara also began testing her arsenal in tiny, undetectable ways. One morning, she added just a few drops of a clear, tasteless liquid, pressed from boiled oleander leaves, into Augustus's coffee. The dose was so small, he merely experienced a day of stomach cramps and clammy skin. The household chalked it up to bad shellfish. Next, Clara slipped a pinch of powdered Jimson weed, datura, into a gravy that Augustus particularly loved. That night he sweated through his sheets, tormented by vivid nightmares of demons and serpents. The doctor was baffled and suggested the young man abstain from heavy seasoning for a while, advice that made Clara nearly smile. With each trial, her confidence grew. The months crawled by, January drawing ever closer, and Clara honed her plan like a blade on a whetstone. She had to be careful. If even a hint of her intentions were discovered, it would mean a noose around her neck. But who would suspect? She was a grieving mother, yes, but also a slave who had never shown a hint of open rebellion. The Masons likely assumed her too numbed by loss to be a threat. In truth, nothing could be more dangerous than a woman with nothing left to lose. As the wedding day approached, Edenwood buzzed with preparations. The ceremony would be held at the plantation, with only family and a couple of close friends in attendance, perhaps 20 people in total. 16 of them, Clara counted, were direct participants or beneficiaries of the society that killed her children. 16 people whom she would make sure did not leave Edenwood alive. She had gathered enough supplies to do the job 10 times over, but Clara meticulously mapped out who would get what. In her mind, each victim's face was paired with a plant or potion from her stores. For Colonel Mason, who had shielded his murderous son and shown more concern for lost property than lost lives, Clara reserved a special extract of oleander and foxglove that would strike at his heart, quite literally, after a fine meal, sending him into cardiac arrest. For Mistress Catherine, who floated through life in a laudanum haze, Clara chose a painless end, a simple syrup of nightshade berries stirred into her dessert wine, so she might drift off to eternal sleep, hardly realizing anything was wrong. For Augustus, the monster himself, Clara's fury was so great that she decided one poison was not enough. She prepared 3 different concoctions for him, to be administered in succession. He would suffer waves of agony, first blinding pain and vomiting, courtesy of powdered fly agaric mushroom, then paralysis that would leave him conscious but unable to move, thanks to crushed Jimson weed seeds. And finally, the oleander, foxglove cocktail, to stop his wicked heart. She wanted him to know what was happening, to understand exactly who had outsmarted him before the darkness claimed him. The extended Sinclair family, the groom Matthew's kin, were not spared her judgment either. Clara only knew them by reputation, but what she'd heard was enough. The patriarch, Bartholomew Sinclair, was rumored to treat his slaves worse than his livestock, with a bullwhip always at his side. Clara set aside water hemlock specifically for his stew, envisioning the convulsions that would rack his burly frame. His wife, Lydia Sinclair, was known for her cold efficiency in managing the estate, which apparently included selling off babies from their mothers if she fancied the profit. For her, Clara prepared a dose of datura that would drag Lydia into a waking nightmare. Let her see the ghosts of those broken families pulling her down to hell. Matthew, the groom and new son-in-law, and Pearl Mason, Clara's own young mistress. Truth be told, a kindly girl, but complicit all the same, would each receive a mercifully fast-acting poison in their wine. Clara had no particular quarrel with the bride and groom beyond their general complicity, so she chose to let them die swiftly holding each other's hands, never fully understanding what had gone wrong on what should have been their perfect day. By the time the date of the wedding arrived, January 28, 1843, Clara was ready. She felt an eerie calm as she rose long before dawn to begin the preparations. Outside, a light frost coated the ground like powdered sugar on a cake, but Clara didn't feel the cold. She moved through the kitchen with purpose, stoking fires, sharpening knives, organizing her ingredients and her poisons. The day was a blur of activity on the plantation. A small army of slaves scrubbed and decorated the great house, while the family fussed over attire and last-minute arrangements. Clara, however, orchestrated the kitchen like a general planning for battle. The menu for the wedding feast was the finest Edenwood had ever seen. And for good reason, as Clara intended it to be memorable. She had methodically laced every course of the banquet with some form of poison, tailoring each dish to her guests' particular sins. The appetizers arrived harmless in appearance, delicate canapes and fresh oysters on ice. But Clara had spiked the tangy mignonette sauce with a tincture that would subtly upset their stomachs and begin the slow work of chaos. Next came the turtle soup, rich and fragrant, quietly infused with an herb that would attack the gut more fiercely as the evening wore on. So far, none of the revelers tasted anything amiss. They sipped and savored, completely oblivious. For the main course, Clara pulled out all the stops. The centerpiece roast pig, glistening with honey mustard glaze, concealed a lethal secret. She had injected the choicest portions with a heart-stilling extract aimed squarely at Colonel Mason and the other eldermen who had built their wealth on cruelty. The side dishes, too, were not spared. The sweet potato casserole that Lydia Sinclair loved carried a dose of a hallucinogenic plant that would make her see the ghosts of all those families she had torn apart. Clara had even doctored the sauces, the gravy on the ham, the fruity glaze on the duck, knowing full well that Augustus adored the duck's cherry sauce. His servings were treated with an especially potent blend, ensuring the young master would endure wave after wave of torment before the end. By the time dessert was due, Clara's plan would be almost complete, but she saved a final flourish for last. she drizzled every plate of warm bread pudding with a velvety vanilla cream. And in that sweet sauce lay a powerful dose of poison derived from crushed seeds. It was the coup de grace, meant to finish off anyone who might somehow still be breathing by the meal's conclusion. Nothing was left to chance. In Clara's mind, the wedding feast had already become an executioner's banquet, and she was both chef and judge overseeing each course of retribution. By late afternoon, the Edenwood grounds were ready for the celebration. The wedding ceremony itself took place just before dusk, in the garden, beneath a canopy of oak branches and white silk ribbons. Pearl Mason stood at the makeshift altar in a gown of imported lace, her face glowing with naive happiness. Matthew Sinclair, dashing in his frock coat, beamed at his bride. They made a handsome couple, and to an outside observer, it was a scene of pure joy. Clara did not watch the ceremony. She had too much to do in the kitchen. But as she oversaw the final platings, she could hear distant strains of the string quartet playing the bridal march, and the faint applause when the vows were done, and the couple shared their first kiss as husband and wife. At sundown, the wedding party and their guests, 16 people in all, gathered in the grand dining hall of the mansion. A long, polished mahogany table stretched the length of the room, glittering with the Mason family's finest china and silver. Candles in tall candelabras cast a warm glow, illuminating faces flushed with anticipation and champagne. The air was thick with the scents of roasted meat, spices, and sugar, a symphony of aromas that Clara had composed to perfection. Clara made sure to personally attend to one crucial task before the formal dinner began. Among the guests were 3 young children, 2 of the Sinclair family's little ones, a boy of 6 and a girl of 8, siblings of the groom, and a Mason cousin about 7 years old. Clara had no intention of harming the innocent. So, as everyone was finding their seats, she presented the children with special treats just for them: sweet warm milk and bowls of honeyed porridge, lightly sprinkled with nutmeg. The mothers smiled appreciatively, thinking the cook was simply thoughtful and giving the restless kids something early. Within 15 minutes, the gentle sedatives Clara had mixed into the treats took effect. The children grew drowsy, their eyelids heavy. Soon, they were politely excused and carried up to an upstairs bedroom to sleep under the watch of a nursemaid, far away from the dining hall. Clara's heart eased a little when she saw them all tucked safely out of harm's way. They would not be part of what was to come. With the children gone and the adults comfortably seated, the grand feast commenced. Course after course flowed from the kitchen, each dish a triumph of flavor and presentation. The guests praised everything lavishly, often pausing to raise a toast to the bride and groom's future, to family prosperity, to old friendships renewed. Colonel Mason, at the head of the table, was in high spirits. The man looked positively proud of the sumptuous spread before them. He caught Clara's eye through the crack of the door at one point and lifted his wine glass in a private salute to his incomparable cook. Clara inclined her head in acknowledgement, expressionless. If one didn't know better, they'd think she was simply concentrating on her duties. The first hint of trouble was so small, it passed almost unnoticed. Midway through the main course, Colonel Bartholomew Sinclair, the groom's father, paused in telling a loud story about a hunting trip. A strange look passed over his face. He pressed a hand to his belly. "Forgive me," he murmured. "I suddenly don't feel quite right." His wife Lydia gave him a concerned glance, which swiftly turned into alarm as she too felt a burning sensation coil in her gut. Across the table, Augustus Mason had been chewing a bite of duck when his fork slipped from his fingers, with a loud clang onto his plate. His hand had gone numb. He stared at it, confused, then tried to push back from the table, only to find his legs wouldn't obey. In the span of a minute, the elegant dinner devolved into pandemonium. Colonel Mason rose, demanding to know what was wrong, but no sooner had he stood than a crushing pain seized his chest. He fell back with a strangled cry, knocking over his chair. Pearl, the bride, leapt up in concern, only to swoon as a wave of dizziness hit her. Matthew caught his new wife in his arms, panic flooding his features. One of his brothers doubled over and began vomiting violently onto the pristine tablecloth, to shrieks of disgust from those near him. Lydia Sinclair was now on her feet, eyes bulging, not only from physical distress, but from visions assaulting her mind. She clawed at the air, screaming, "Get away from me! Keep away!" Perhaps to her, the ghosts were already swarming. Augustus tried to speak, to call for a servant or for help, but found he could not form words. A thin line of drool escaped the corner of his mouth as he slid sideways. He toppled onto the floor with a heavy thud, fully conscious, but horrifyingly aware that he was trapped in a body that would not move. His worst nightmare, utter powerlessness, had become reality. Through the chaos, Clara stepped into the dining hall doorway, silently observing the fruits of her labor. Her presence went largely unnoticed by the guests, who were far too busy dying to pay heed to a lone cook. But Augustus saw her. Lying on the floor, his head twisted at an angle, he had a clear view of the kitchen entrance. Clara stood there, hands clasped calmly before her white apron, her face serene and cold. Their eyes met. In Clara's dark gaze, Augustus saw no pity, no panic, only satisfaction. In that moment, Augustus Mason understood that all of this horror was her doing. If he could have moved, he would have lunged at her with whatever strength remained. Instead, he could only gurgle, his body convulsing as the final poison gripped his heart. Clara watched him, tilting her head slightly as if memorizing the image. Then, with deliberate grace, she turned and walked back into the kitchen. Clara did not need to see the rest to know the outcome. She had planned it meticulously. There was no escaping it now for anyone in that room. The sounds told the tale. Chairs scraping, glasses shattering on the floor, the thud of one body after another collapsing. The panicked cries of those who still had voices gave way, one by one, to moans, then whimpers, then silence. A few servants who had been attending the dinner, and wisely hadn't eaten a bite, screamed and ran for help, but by the time any help arrived, it was far too late. In the kitchen, Clara quickly removed her apron and wiped down the work surfaces to eliminate any stray traces of her concoctions. She had anticipated living through this moment countless times in her mind, and now that it was here, she felt strangely at peace. From her apron pocket, she drew out the folded paper bearing the message she had written for this occasion. Clara set it dead center on the large wooden table, where, hours before, she had carefully arranged plates of delicacies. The note read, "For Daniel, Rebecca, and Henry. Justice has been served. Clara Turner." The words were steady, the script graceful. Anyone who read it would know exactly what it meant. Without a backward glance, Clara slipped out of the kitchen's back door and into the night. The cool air hit her face, carrying with it the distant sound of shouting as plantation staff and a few late-arriving guests rushed toward the big house to investigate the commotion. Clara pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and disappeared into the darkness, her figure soon swallowed by the thick line of cypress trees beyond the quarters. In her pocket, she had a small pouch of roasted corn and a flask of water, enough to sustain her for a day or two. She had hidden other caches of food and supplies along a planned route weeks beforehand. Clara did not know exactly where she would ultimately go, only that she had to keep going. And so, on foot, and under the cover of a moonless sky, the cook from Edenwood Plantation began the journey of a ghost, neither seen nor heard, but felt in every gust of wind that rustled the winter-barren branches. The mass poisoning at Edenwood Plantation sent shockwaves across the South. Come morning, neighbors and officials who rushed to the scene were met with a tableau of horror. The grand dining hall filled with collapsed guests, fine china scattered among lifeless bodies. 16 members of 2 esteemed families lay dead or dying amid half-eaten wedding cake and spilled wine. It didn't take long for the survivors' accounts and Clara's chilling note on the kitchen table to reveal the truth. This was no accident, but an act of methodical revenge. Authorities launched a manhunt for Clara, fanning out across the countryside with hounds and posting a $500 reward for her capture, dead or alive. But it was as if the very swamps had swallowed her whole. Some claimed to spot a lone woman trudging along back roads or boarding a riverboat north, yet every lid turned cold. Whether Clara perished in the wild or slipped away to freedom, no one in authority could say. She simply vanished. In the weeks that followed, a cloud of paranoia descended on plantation households throughout the region. The elite realized with dread that the very servants who cooked their meals and washed their linens might secretly hunger for justice of their own. Many slaveholding families dismissed their black cooks, hastily hiring white chefs at exorbitant cost for peace of mind. At dinners, hosts began tasting each dish first, or even employing food tasters like medieval kings. The legend of Clara's vengeance put a crack in the facade of genteel Southern society, a reminder that those oppressed had both memories and means, given opportunity. The survivors of that night were few. The 3 young children who had been led away to bed before the meal slept through the nightmare and woke to a world changed forever. Orphaned by Clara's hand, yet spared by her mercy, they were raised by extended kin who kept the gruesome details secret. Yet as they grew, each admitted to peculiar dreams, of a gentle voice humming a lullaby in the dark, of a warm presence watching over them. They would never know it, but perhaps on that deadly night, the same woman who took so much also gave them the gift of life. As for Edenwood Plantation, it never shook off the stain of that evening. Business ceased, and the estate was eventually sold off for a pittance, avoided by locals who whispered it was cursed. Some said the very soil there refused to bear crop again. In the slave quarters across the South, however, Clara's name was whispered not with fear, but with a fierce, quiet pride. She had been a cook, a nobody in the eyes of the masters, but she had shown that even a nobody could balance the scales if pushed far enough. Clara's husband, Jacob, was questioned repeatedly, but ultimately released. He truly had known nothing of her plot. Heartbroken and alone, he lived out the next years as a free blacksmith after Edenwood's dissolution. Those who knew him say he never remarried. On his deathbed after the Civil War, his final words were a message of understanding and forgiveness for his wife, a gentle release for a woman who would never hear it. Reverend Polk, who officiated the doomed wedding, was said to be unable to finish another ceremony after that night. His hands would tremble, and his voice would falter each time he spoke the words, "Till death do us part." He died not long after, some say of sheer fright and a broken spirit. To this day, locals in that part of South Carolina swap stories about Edenwood. On certain cold, moonless nights, when the wind rustles through the old oak trees, some swear they hear the faint strains of a woman's voice carried on the breeze. A lullaby, they say, or perhaps a whispered phrase, "Justice is served." Whether it's just a ghost tale or something more, one thing is clear. Clara's act of defiance left an indelible mark on the land and on the conscience of everyone who hears this story. The tale of the slave girl who poisoned a wedding feast serves as both inspiration and warning. In a single night, Clara Turner transformed a celebration of love into a reckoning with guilt, a court of justice at a dinner table. Her act wasn't random rage. It was precise, born of unbearable loss, and executed with the very skills her oppressors had valued in her. She reminds us that behind every oppression, there lurks the potential for rebellion, and that those who are written off as powerless may someday write their own fate in the blood of their tormentors. Clara's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and revenge. Was she simply a cold-blooded murderer, or did she become an instrument of a justice that official society denied her? In her mind, she avenged not only her children, but generations of the enslaved whose pain had been ignored. Knowledge, the thing Mama Grace told her no one could steal, became Clara's weapon. With patience and cunning, she proved that knowledge and determination can be more powerful than any chain or whip. In the end, whether Clara found peace in life or not remains a mystery. Perhaps she did reach the North and lived out her days under a new name, forever looking over her shoulder. Or perhaps she perished anonymous and unfree, but with the comfort that her children's spirits were avenged. What's certain is that her memory lives on. Clara Turner wasn't just a cook at a plantation. She became a symbol of the fury born from injustice, of the lengths a mother will go to for her children, and of the untold stories simmering beneath the surface of official history. History isn't only the tales of great men and famous battles. It's also made of quiet, desperate acts by those whom the history books often overlook. Acts of courage, of defiance, and yes, of terrifying vengeance like Clara's. Her story, once nearly lost to the hush of those official records, now speaks to us through time with a voice that demands to be heard. If this story touched something inside you, it's because Clara Turner's memory still walks among us, reminding us that true freedom sometimes exacts a price few are willing to pay. Share this story with someone who needs to know that even in history's darkest moments, there were those who refused to accept injustice in silence. If you want more stories like this, revealing the hidden, haunting chapters of America's past, hit that subscribe button now. Leave a like to support this work and tell us in the comments, Do you believe Clara truly found freedom in the end? Was her vengeance justified, or did she cross a line that can't be uncrossed? History doesn't give easy answers, but it gives us Clara, a woman who decided that some injustices are too great to forgive, and some memories too powerful to forget.